All right, sweet. We're recording. Dakota, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and being one of our first guests. I was wondering if you could introduce yourself, and you can take that however you want to. Who is Dakota Jones?
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here. This is a really cool project. It's fun to be part of it. I'm Dakota Jones. I am a trail runner. I'm from Colorado, Utah. Kind of bounced around over the last 20 plus years. But I currently live in Salt Lake City. Um, and yeah, I've been running ultra marathons since I was in high school and kind of defined my career and my life around the trail space and outdoors, mountains and traveling, and specifically long distance running. I've been involved in climate advocacy, like in various ways, like in my brain forever, but like officially sort of since like 2017 or so. I started getting involved with Protect Our Winters then and did some initiatives on my own. And then in 2021, I founded a nonprofit called Footprints Running, and we have these running camps where everybody comes and we have fun runs and a great time, but we also everybody develops a personal climate project to mobilize their community to take action on climate change. There's a short story.
So cool. Yeah, I love it. Thank you. And I know you kind of got into this a little bit just in the trajectory of your career, but one thing I'm asking everyone that comes on the show is what was your kind of aha moment on climate or environment? What was the, if you have like a specific time where you kind of realized that you wanted to be involved in this fight or in this movement, or in general in your life, like what was that aha moment for you on climate?
Yeah, I wish it was like an inspiring story. I just am like many people where I have always cared a whole lot about climate change and environmental action. I grew up in Southwest Colorado, Southeast Utah, which are some of the most spectacular landscapes in the US. And my dad was super into the outdoors, and I was taught all these like wilderness values and kind of grew up in this outdoor consciousness. And so protecting the outdoors has always been important to me. And I've always wanted to be involved. I would never took action publicly really until 2017 because I just felt like I was traveling too much. I was too much a part of the problem to be able to be like talk about solutions. But then Donald Trump was elected president, and I was like, I honestly stayed up the whole night, maybe two nights. And it was like, I mean, just like feeling real fear for the future of the world. And the only way to really overcome fear is through action. I don't know whether that action is effective or just distraction. It's better to do nothing, or better to do something than to do nothing. It's better to try than to just give up. So that's when I really started to be like, well, yes, I'm very imperfect, but I'm going to get involved no matter what it takes and do anything. You know, a little bit of good is better than no good at all.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think you're not alone in having that aha moment. I that
Yeah.
feels very relevant to me too, where it was like that was literally when I decided to apply to go back to grad school to figure I was like,
Uh,
well, if we have this is our president now, like we got to have folks on climate policy, we got to have folks on, and I didn't even know if I wanted to do climate. I was just like, we need people. We need people to come like
yeah.
sort of like
I mean, it's
rally
soldiers.
and go help. So yeah, so I mean that's super, yeah, that's super relevant, or it definitely resonates with me too.
Mm.
And I think I also was curious, like you mentioned traveling all over the world and you're a professional athlete. You've done this for a long time, maybe even longer than many people in the sport, and you're still quite young. I'm curious, what either today or even back then, like what you were seeing when you were traveling. Like, were you experiencing trails a different way? I can imagine you went back to the same trails over the years. Like, were you, I don't know, just kind of like as you had this awakening on climate, which sounds like you had environmentalism embedded in your life for a long time since you were young. But did you, just curious if you started to sort of see patterns or like see this show up in the world, or was it more of something you were just aware of, but we weren't really seeing it on trails yet, or seeing it in kind of the natural world you were running in?
Yeah, it's a good question. One thing that makes me think of is that, even as trail runners or maybe outdoor users of any kind, just the fact of being in the outdoors a lot does not necessarily mean that you're like observing the outdoors in any sort of
Hmm.
intimate capacity. Um, I personally sometimes get lost in my head and will run for an hour and I like don't look around at all. I'm just like completely oblivious. Like I see where my feet are going so I don't fall, but it's like I realize after the run that I didn't look at anything. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because
Hmm.
it's good to think and process things. But um, it's possible to focus on certain things at the expense of others while running. For example, it's possible to focus on your pace and your time and your vertical and whatever else at the expense of, the flowers or the trees or the glaciers. It's also hard to sometimes pay attention to what's around you when you're like running down a technical trail, because if you don't pay attention to the actual trail, then you fall down. And so I I think that I have had to sort of teach myself to be aware in the outdoors and to pay close attention. But I also think that I am reflective and I pay attention while on the trail and while off the trail, and I will run and also just go for walks or sit in places and look and think. And so when I really started doing this, I was often, I mean, I was just young and I was super excited to travel and have these amazing opportunities. Before I was 22, I got to go to like Chamonix multiple times and like Japan and Australia, I think, and
Wow.
like maybe South America. Like I got to travel all over the place, and
Wow.
it's still something I get to do, and it's incredible. It's something that I still look around like feeling like somebody's gonna figure out that I don't belong here and tell the people in charge or something. Uh, but so it's been like really I've always really wanted to be grateful for that and just like take advantage of it for as long as I have these opportunities. Because like traveling for the outdoors, it's not just like going to the place, which is amazing in itself, but it's like I get to go to a new place, a foreign place, and be integrated into a community of people, and that makes the travel feel like an experience. And so like when I have been traveling for trails and mountain stuff and races ever since I was like a kid, I was paying as much attention, if not more, to the people around me as I was to like the places I was at. And
Yeah.
to be honest, like I've looked around at landscapes as sort of like a backdrop or a setting, like like that's an amazing mountain, or this is an incredible scene, or I really want to climb that. Not so much for like the nuances of its own sort of existence and value, intrinsic value, I guess. I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm really saying what I mean here, but
No, no.
uh, I have seen changes. One thing that really came to mind when you said that also is like in Colorado, the trees are dying. The pine beetle has killed massive
Hmm.
swaths of the pine trees, and that's something that when I was in high school, there were big ass beautiful green pine forests, and now I go back and there are massive, huge stands of just totally dead trees, and it's really hard to see that. We don't have glaciers in Colorado, but going back to Chamonix year by year, it's like, is it different? Is it
Yeah.
shorter? I think so. Is it smaller? I could compare photos. I look at the glaciers and I'm like,
Yeah.
it looks awful dirty. I don't know. No, I can't say that I am as observant as I'd like to be, but
Well, no, it also
I
makes
don't know.
sense with the speed at which you're running on trails. So absolutely, absolutely understand that. But and I think what you said too about people. I mean, like in a lot of the climate work or environmental work I do, or even just conversations I have, like it's so often about, and we talk about this too, actually, on the trailhead. Like there's sort of this interesting, like keeping nature pristine, right, or keeping people out of, it's like sort of cordoned off or it's preserved in a certain way. And sometimes you have spaces preserved for like recreation, right? Like a national park or um, that's kind of the one that's popping into my mind of there's trails and there's ways that people can access the space. But there's so often not people at the heart of those conversations. And at this, like, I think you can't have environmental protection or environmental justice, certainly, without communities. So when you say, you're going to these places, you're embedding in communities and the landscape is the backdrop, it's like that definitely goes along with this idea that if we don't cater to programs that also center communities and people, when the what are we doing? What are we doing on climate? Because I think like it's all
For
well and good
sure.
to preserve the glacier, Sure, but I mean, obviously that's very, very good to do. But it's also, I think, so often there's a lot of environmental programming that kind of just talks about the trees and the environment and the mountain and doesn't talk about like, well, how do people relate to these spaces? And we could even
Right.
obviously get into a lot with indigenous communities who have been on the land since time immemorial and before everyone else. So I think that gets into really interesting things. But you mentioned travel and all the travel you've done. And I don't know how many people know this about you. And actually, my partner Ryan was the one to remind me that you took a cargo ship across the Atlantic to go on one of your running adventures. You biked Western states last year, and then I think you trained home. You've done,
Mhm.
and I mean, these are just behavior changes in the travel space, but I know you've made other changes in your life that you've talked about. And I remember seeing you on a panel or at a presentation last year around the UTMB timeline that Normal put on. That was really great. And you've talked before about the behavior changes that you've made in your own life, as extreme as taking a ship across the ocean to get to Europe, and how that's not necessarily always accessible to everybody, and not even necessarily sustainable. Take that word as you
Yeah.
will, but in
Yeah,
your
there's a
own
funny
life. And
word.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, right. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like those shifts that you made in your life, and then where you're at with behavior change and how we sort of, because I feel like we need to make those kinds of things accessible. And you went to like a lot of extremes. I almost feel like you've like tested these out for everybody, and you're like, all right, I don't
Yeah.
know how real that is in people's lives, but yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk about that kind of shift you made in your travel specifically, but then other changes in your life and where you're at now with that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have it wrapped up in a great thesis about where I'm at now, but
Sure.
yeah, like these efforts that I made, especially like I took the cargo ship across the Atlantic in 2016, which is the year before I got involved with POW. Because I had
Okay.
this idea, I want to be a climate advocate one day, but I got to be perfect first. I can't be contributing to climate change and also talk about it. This was
Interesting.
the beginnings of my journey to realize that, there's literally no way to basically be a human being on the planet now without contributing to climate change. Um, but like the cargo ship across the ocean is a interesting example because for one, it was a cool trip. I mean, I got to spend, I think it was like 17 days. It's also funny, you sign a release that's like, yes, I know that I am the least important person on this boat. So
Oh,
I will go wherever the boat goes, Like literally it's like, yeah, we're going where the cargo
wow.
is and you're just along for the ride, but we'll get to where you're signed to go eventually. So I was set to go from
Wow.
Philadelphia to Antwerp in Belgium. And like we left Philadelphia in the evening, and I go out there like Titanic. I'm very proud of the ship. I'm looking out at Philadelphia and the Delaware River, and it was awesome. I go inside feeling like a captain of the seas, and then I woke up in the morning and I looked out and I was like, man, the sun's coming up on the left, which means we're going south. And I was like, I'm pretty sure we didn't want to go south to get to Europe. And then, I didn't know anybody on the boat. Like literally, like I didn't know anybody. It's all Filipino crew and
Hmm.
Eastern European um, leadership. At
Hmm.
one point I asked a Filipino guy about that, and he's like, "We don't talk about that."
Oh.
Yeah. Uh, but anyway, so
Nice.
eventually somebody
Okay.
like halfway through the day, somebody was like, "Oh yeah, we're going to North Carolina now. There's a cargo." And so we went to North Carolina for a day, and then
Oh man.
we sat stationary offshore like 5 miles for 4 days, and then we went on to shore in North Carolina, and they gave me 4 hours. They're like, "You can go on shore for 4 hours, but then we're leaving, whether you're here or not." And so I went for a 3 hour and 55 minute run, and then I got back on the boat and we went north across to it was really cool. I mean, it took for like days and days, and you like go all the way, you curve northeast up and into the North Atlantic off of like Newfoundland, and then you start cruising across like
Wow.
south of Iceland. And it's amazing out there. The ocean's huge, but there's always like other ships, or almost always you can see like in the far distance, especially at night,
Hmm.
because there's no lights anywhere except these other boats that you can kind of see in the far distance. And the captain was this Eastern European guy. Um, I don't want to say he was Romanian, I think. and he looked like he was like a Bond villain, but everything he said was incredibly
That's
nice.
what I'm
You know,
picturing.
he was like,
Okay.
"Hey," yeah, he was like, "Hey, you want to come up on the bridge anytime? You're welcome." And I was like, "All right." And so I did. And the bridge is like where they drive the boat, you know, with the steering wheel. And there's huge windows all around, and it's like, I mean, it's 8 stories or something off the deck of the boat, and the deck is like 50
Oh.
feet off the water, so you're way the hell up there. And there's huge windows and maps and computers. It's really cool. I'd hang out there. I made friends with this guy named Jose, who was the third mate, and they work like 4-hour shifts on every 12-hour time, so it's like 8 to
Hmm.
12, 8 to 12. It was cool. So I'd go hang out with him, and you could watch, like, one time there was a lightning storm at night out in the ocean. It was amazing.
Whoa.
Um,
Whoa.
yeah, it was cool. It was also interesting talking to some guys because one of the guys was like, "Why are you doing this?" And I was like, "I don't know." I felt like kind of embarrassed to explain, like, "Yeah, the climate change, you know."
Yeah.
Um, and I was like, kind of a cool. I was like, "It's experience." He's like, "You should just fly." You know, like, he didn't get it. And why would he? Because it's actually a super privileged thing to do, to pay whatever I
Mm.
paid, 1,000, 1,500 bucks, to be able to take this boat across the ocean, when most people have like the amount of time I took across the ocean as the entire vacation, right? Like,
Hmm.
if that. And so it's like a super privileged thing to get to do. And it's also like it was just, my takeaway from it was that, like, it was very like a super interesting experience for me to get to have, but the boats are incredibly inefficient. Like, they're super dirty, and as soon as they get in international waters, they switch the fuel,
Hmm.
so it's incredibly dirty, and they're just puffing black smoke, like terrible black smoke, all day
Whoa.
long. And the crew spends most of their time chipping paint and repainting the boat. They're always swarming the decks because of the paint, the well, the sea air is caustic as it's on its own, but also, like, especially the smoke is just so
Oh.
corrosive that it's like, yeah. And so this is what every cargo ship in the
Huh.
world is doing as we speak. Um,
Yeah.
and so what it turns out is, like, if I took this cargo ship across the ocean and it was technically climate neutral because the boat was definitely going anyway and my weight's negligible. However, if everybody is like, Dakota's nailed it, we're going to do that too, and then there's like
Yeah.
20,000 people that want to do this, then all of a sudden the economics of these boats change and they switch from carrying cargo to carrying people, and they are less efficient in an energy perspective than an airplane, you know?
Huh. Yeah.
And so, like, it was a cool thing for me to try, and like this nice sacrifice that I get to get all this credit for, but really, like, it was a it's not the way we are going to solve climate change, right?
Hmm.
However, I don't regret doing it. It was fun. I got off in France. They made another surprise stop in France, and I was like, "Dude, you got to let me out of here," and they did, and it was fun. But it was cool. I had a really great time there. But yeah, it was like kind of an interesting experiment that I think, I don't know if it failed is the right answer, but that's not the solution to climate change. That was a really long story. I don't think I
Yeah.
even started answering your
No, I
question. Sorry.
loved it. No, 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 no. This is great. I love it. It's also, yeah, if anything else, it's a story that you have, like the cargo ship. Maybe not the
Yeah,
solution to
yeah, it was
climate
cool.
change, but it's a great story. But I also really appreciate what you said about having the privilege of like money and time to get to do something like that. And it's interesting seeing, there's a monetary investment in things like solar panels, although there's also
Hmm.
great policies out there that help with that. But it's really interesting to see kind of the like privilege and access and accessibility of some of these climate solutions. And so something like that, where everyone's like, "Oh man, you took a ship, that's wild," but like there is, and even, I mean, biking, I feel like is like really badass that you did that. And it's also like, yeah, that's time, and sure, it's like purchasing the bike, but like you clearly went for it in these experiments of like trying to get to the place you need to go. And honestly, expending a lot of energy in the biking example before a huge race you were going to do, but
Yeah.
like that's, you care that much about doing that, and making that, or sending that message is kind of how I received it. It's like, okay, that means that much to Dakota, that like, this is the message you want to
Yeah.
send, and like to share with
Well,
others, so
thank
like
you.
you're doing this and you're taking these actions. And then I think I mean, it's interesting to like watch the various experimentation that you've done over the years. And I think like what you also said about I'm not a perfect advocate, so I need to like get perfect, or I need to be like the best climate advocate I can be to then talk about climate action, is also something that like we've even talked about. Like I grapple with like who is perfect, who is doing climate action kind of in like the best way and who can be the best advocate. I think a lot of people grapple with that. A lot of the folks that I follow, the climate advocates that I follow are kind of like, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to define, what perfection is, or like how do you get to that point. And I think what I'm seeing too with what you've done with footprints, and that's kind of what I want to talk about next, is like inviting folks in. We should also say, to full disclosure, I'm going to be a mentor at camp this year, so did want to like say that, and I'm very excited about that. But it's been really amazing to watch you design this program that brings people in, like meets people where they're at, which is something I want to talk about too. Like, what does that mean in climate action? But yeah, I guess like in general, just curious if you could talk a little bit more about like, all right, you did these, you kind of tested these out. Obviously, the bike ride and the train ride have been after you founded Footprints, but like you've done a lot of personal changes in your own life. But then you started something that encouraged climate action from other people too. So like, what was the kind of metamorphosis of that? How did that come to be? And yeah, just talk a little bit more about Footprints and how that came to fruition.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so it does. I think there is like a sort of a narrative from the cargo ship, because the next one, similar kind of thing that I tried, was I think 2 years later in 2018. That was the first bike trip I took. So I rode my bike from Silverton, Colorado, where I was living that summer, up to Colorado Springs, over like 250 miles in
Okay.
like 4 days. And then I ran the Pikes Peak Marathon, and then I ran
Okay.
back or rode back. That was the first time I did that, and it went like super well. Like everything worked out somehow, and I won the race, and it was a fundraiser for Protect Our Winters, and we got like $11,000 for POW.
Wow.
Um, and it just like was a really cool way of showing that, like, for me, the climate's more important than the race, but ideally, you can have both. And so,
You
I
can have
could.
both.
Yeah, right. And so that worked, and it was great. But it was also imperfect, right? It was less imperfect than the cargo ship, because the bike doesn't have maybe the same problems as the cargo ship. But at the same time, it's like I'm eating food that had been trucked into the grocery store from however far away. My clothes came from Asia or something, and my bike was made out of steel, which is coal, and um,
Hmm.
all kinds of imperfections there. And at the end of the day, the real imperfection with that trip was that people with like jobs and kids, they can't do that, like you can't just wave goodbye to your wife and kids or husband and kids, and just go ride your bike for 2 weeks to do a hard thing and then ride your bike 2 weeks
Right.
back, and 250 miles is a super close race for some of us, right? So it just wasn't a super like repeatable experience for the public, even within this like privileged sphere of people in the outdoor space already.
Hmm.
Um, and so, I think that the value there was that I was able to use my platform effectively. We raised money for Protect Our Winters. That was an outcome that had value. And I used my platform as a runner who people follow, because I can win a race or something. And then I could like amplify this message through doing the
Mm-hmm.
spectacle, essentially.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
awesome. And I also got to have fun doing the spectacle and have a cool adventure. So that was great. But like the takeaway from that was like, what if we're going to make this like repeatable, then like we got to find ways for every single person to use whatever platform and skills they
Hmm.
have. Like we got to find their version of this Pikes Peak bike trip that I did. And that's not something that I can like put into a book or I don't know, an Instagram post and be like, yeah, use your platform. And it's like, what does that mean? What is your platform? How do you use it? Like, what are your skills? How do you like use them? It's like, well, I'm a copy editor. How do I use that for climate change? Um, I think that the way that we figure this out is by coming together and sharing an experience where like people who are experts in like making taking action and making the most of these things can really help you like strategize on these topics and figure out like you are good at doing this, these people, this is the action you want to take, and so like here's your role, and then how are you going to get everybody else to fill these other roles that you can't currently fill. um, that was kind of the sort of initial outline with footprints. A lot of these ideas came from from talking with friends in Durango. Claire Gallagher helped me a ton with setting up these
Mm-hmm.
ideas originally in 2018, 2019. Um, but yeah, the idea was just like, I want to have a running camp because I feel like that brings people together around a shared interest that gives like a sense of personal value. And then I want it to be environmentally focused, but it's not enough to raise awareness. We're all aware of climate change. We have to like
Right.
have some outcome. And then it's like, what is an outcome that is valuable? Well, there's many ways to think of that, but why not help people to develop a project that they can like act on in the place they live, in their community, based on the skills that they have, something that is important to them because they propose this to us. So everybody has a project. We spend a week running and talking and hanging out and getting to know each other and trusting each other in the mountains. And then we work on these projects with the help of experts and mentorship and community. How's that sound?
That's so awesome. That's great. That's perfect. No, and it's I think it's interesting to hear because I've shared with you this too, like that I'm on my own journey in climate action of like what does climate action mean? Can I be an advocate or activist in this space without being perfect myself? And I think what's so cool is watching you design something that took your own skills and passions of running and being outdoors, and also your knowledge of climate, and being like, all right, we're going to bring people together and we're going to design actionable projects. And that's something that, because I talk, yeah, like I've mentioned this already, but I think a lot about like meeting people where they're at. How do you kind of what is something that can be a small change someone can make in their lives? Like, it's interesting when people are like, oh, well, vegetarianism or veganism, like just go vegan or go vegetarian. And it's like, that's actually like also quite privileged. Like, depending on where you
Yeah, it's
live and the
hard and
access
it
to
can be
food you
expensive.
have
Yeah.
and like the cost and expensive. Like, so I think it's interesting because it's like, yeah, there are small actions we can all take, but there's also, and I've seen this as a incoming mentor, like there are amazing folks out there who have these ideas around climate in the back of their brain, but maybe haven't ever acted on it. And there's so many people, like I would guess that there are, many, many more folks like this with these ideas than applied or maybe wanted to come to a running and hiking camp, but have these ideas. And so I always think about that too, like how can we engender that climate action? How can we continue to catalyze folks to like take an action in their community that might not be perfect, but hopefully it's like accessible to them at least. um
Yeah.
and in that vein, I know, and we can talk about this to the extent that you want to, but I know last year at Footprints there were also some hard conversations that came up and some tough situations with campers and mentors. And I think a lot of really good has come from that, from what I can tell, and the deep dive that you've done on your own organization since then. But I was just wondering if, again, to the extent you want to, if you wanted to share some of the challenges and difficult moments that came up at last year's camp, and what Footprints has done kind of in the years since.
Yeah. Yeah. So last year was our third camp. And the first 2 years were in Colorado. The last year we moved to northern Vermont because we have it was a really good outdoor location. Well, it's a camp sort of. It's like a ski outdoor sail, rowing, running camp. It's a really, really nice spot called the Craftsberry Outdoor Center. We have a good relationship with them. So we moved there last year. Um, yeah, and so we I think each year we've improved and grown, and like we did things a whole lot better last year than we did certain things in the past. But we also, one of the things that we did well was we appealed to a broader audience, and so like a greater proportion of the people who came last year were people of color. And I mean, it's something I'm not sure if I'm even honestly like kind of nervous to like explain everything because I think
Yeah.
that like basically what happened was that I just am not educated or experienced enough. I haven't taken the time or the education, or I hadn't then to effectively put on an experience for people of color, because especially around the climate space, which climate change disproportionately affects women and people of color. In a way that it probably will never affect me as a white man. And so, I just was able to make assumptions based on my own experience that put some of the people that were at the camp in like really uncomfortable, possibly even dangerous situations. You know, unlike the less dangerous but certainly wrong and offensive end was like I think some of the feedback we got was like much of our curriculum had like kind of a white savior perspective to it. You know,
Hmm.
we're promoting these ideas that have been like, you know, climate change is a big bad problem, and here's all these solutions, you know, that are often technical solutions created by white people that are sort of imposed on these communities of color, without their participation in that decision making process. You know, it's kind of a conventional and common approach, and it can be really harmful. In within the experience itself, one example of a big mistake we made was, you know, instead of running on one of the days, we do a volunteer day, and we
Hmm.
partner with a local organization to do some cleanup from some floods that had occurred in northern Vermont last year. Um, and I just didn't do my homework. I didn't think of it this way, again, because I don't have to as a white man, which is, this doesn't, I don't mean that as like an excuse. This is my
Yeah.
explanation of my own fault here. But you know, we have several groups of people, multiple people in cars, and for example, one of the cars it was all people of color, and we're coordinating with the people, the organizers here, and we're like, hey, will you go? And they told us to go pick up some boxes. Some people had been like forced to move out of their house because of the flooding. They were going to move the boxes to a different house. And so we send this car over there, and it turns out that it's right next to a police station. The feedback we got is that people of color don't feel safe next to police stations in towns they've never
Yeah.
been to, in especially predominantly white towns. And I had no idea this police station was there, and I didn't realize that I was sending them into a situation that, even if I had known that, I probably wouldn't have even thought of that. And that's something that made them
Hmm.
feel unsafe. And this is an event that I've organized, so it's my fault. And you know, those are just two examples. I think somebody who was there might have, you know, more to say on the matter, and I don't want to say that I've like covered it exhaustively here, but that's an example of how, you know, my privilege has blinded me to certain aspects of the climate conversation that can actually like work against what we're all trying to accomplish, right? Like, because this has to be focused on people, it has to be focused on community, and it's so easy to focus on these like technical solutions that kind of ignore the people who are worst affected by this. So this was brought to our attention, and it was extremely emotional, extremely hard. Honestly, I've been traumatized ever
Hmm.
since, and my confidence has been super low for the last year, focused on climate or on footprints and stuff.
Yeah.
But it wasn't brought to us in like a aggressive or hurtful way. It was just like brought to our attention that like this has happened and it is bad and it can never happen again. And so we paused everything with footprints after the camp, and we made sure that, you know, we understood exactly what the feedback was, how we had created the situation, and we did whatever we could to make reparations to the people involved, you know, including like refunds and like trying, you know, just talking, you know, just trying to like give them
Hmm.
our time and our attention and apologize honestly, which is small and maybe it's not enough, but it's something. You know, we worked a lot on that, and we paused everything, and we actually had to cancel a camp we were working with in Australia. Um, but what
Hmm.
we ultimately did over the last winter was we reached out to several people, for like consulting guidance on these issues, you know, making sure to like pay consultants for their time to like discuss what happened, how we might move forward from this. Protect Our Winters paid for some time with a really great consultant named Leander Lacey. Some other friends within the outdoor space have helped us out too. And in the end, we expanded our board of directors from 3 people up to now it's 7 people. It's a majority people of color on the and women on the board of directors now. And we totally overhauled our mission statements and our vision and our values, so that now the organization's focus is really on climate justice. It's not climate change, it's climate justice,
Hmm.
right? Sort of which is just a much more holistic approach to climate change, which is really focusing on how, you know, social justice and environmental problems are not two different problems. These are the same problem, and they are focus. They are basic. They come from the same inequalities, the same um, the same deep rooted like systemic issues in our society. And so, um, when people are excluded from our society and especially from decision-making processes, then they don't get to have a say. They don't get to have any ownership over the things that happen to them, even when those things that happen are supposed to be solutions to a problem that like the same kind of failed decision making has created for these societies or for these communities who are most vulnerable to this. Um, I don't know if I explained that clearly or very well. I mean, you might be better at it than I am, but the end result here is that we have a uh, much more intentional, targeted mission statement, vision, and values for the organization. And every action we take as an organization is focused on rebranding our work towards social justice so that we can ensure that we won't make these mistakes again. And within the camp planning, there's a million little steps so that we will make sure that every decision, every action, activity, everything is like reviewed by multiple different people from different places, different backgrounds, to try to minimize the risk of this happening again. And yeah, I think we're a much stronger organization for it. We have some amazing people involved that were never involved before. And I really think that if the trajectory we're going, we can continue to start doing really good work. This coming
No,
camp in
continue as
October
well.
is the start of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So
No, I really
I
appreciate
don't know
you
if that makes
explaining all that,
sense.
Dakota. And yeah, absolutely. It's really helpful to hear not only kind of the what and some of the stories that emerge. And obviously I also appreciate and want to acknowledge that like that is, yes, there were people that experienced probably a lot more during that week and have more to share. But I do want to say, I mean, I think having the conversations I'm privileged to have on the podcast, The Trail Ahead, the other podcast I co-host, there's a lot of times where Faith, my co-host, and I will talk about having everyone at the table and bringing everyone into the conversation around justice, around equity and access. And when we first, I think I've shared this with you before, but I'll say it again. We first started the podcast, I sort of said, well, I should, like I'm a white woman, I shouldn't be on the podcast, I shouldn't be a host. And Faith was like, no, this is the point. Like, we need everyone at the table talking about this topic. And that also in this case means having you, Dakota, with a white man with the privilege that you carry and the knowledge that you and the platform that you have that you've talked
Yeah.
about, being able to like elevate and we talk about sort of passing the mic or shining the spotlight elsewhere, and I think that you now you can do that even more effectively having had this experience. I definitely think you guys are stronger for it, having watched kind of the arc of this happen. But I also think we have to have everyone in this conversation. And as you said, it's not climate change, it's climate justice. Like, I actually think it should just be that, period. Like, it's climate justice. Like, that needs to be kind of in the vein
It
of
is the
like
same thing.
involving communities. It's the same thing. It's like, it has to be, they're intertwined, they're inextricably linked. You cannot talk about, I think, environmental preservation or conservation or any of these actions without talking about the communities involved. And I know we touched on that earlier too. But so, anyways, I really appreciate you talking through that. And I think it's pretty amazing to see someone. Like, I know we've also talked about kind of like imperfect activism or just starting something but not being sure if it's the right thing to do or if it's perfect. And certainly Footprints has gone through a lot of growth and growing pains in some and comfortable moments, and I also really appreciate you highlighting like potentially dangerous moments, and that's obviously not something we ever want to have happen. And so but where it's at now and the way that you've been able to grow it, I think is a really cool example of like, we're taking action, we're trying to do the best we can and like truly cause no harm, but at the same time, it does get into the conversation of like, is no action better than action? And I think in this case, I've sort of seen this
Yeah,
like
it's hard.
it's a tough one. Yeah, that's
I
a
don't
really
want to.
tough one,
I mean, the
especially.
idea of hurting people and like the idea of suggesting that, the people who were harmed last year are sort of like necessary sacrifices on the road to a better footprints or
No,
something. And I know that's not what you're saying
totally,
at all.
totally.
But when I put these camps together, I do it for the people, and I just want everybody to be stronger and happier. And better for
Yeah.
it. And when something like that happens, it's just devastating. And it's I don't want you to tell me that's
Yeah.
okay. It wasn't, but we're trying to move forward. And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I mean, it's like I do have this platform now, and so I think we can do a good job.
I think you can too, and I'll say we because I'll be a part of this year's camp. But
Yeah,
yeah, I it's clear where I'm going with this is that it's clear that you care so much, and I know that intention and impact are different things. We know this, but I do think that like I'm not seeing a lot of, I'll just be like really blunt, I'm not seeing a lot of pro runners doing like what you're doing, like I'm not seeing a lot of people doing what you're doing. Like you've been able to like put yourself out there, and sure there's privilege and time and money and stuff, but like having the ability to like you still took like a 17-day cargo ship, like you know what I mean, like that's still stuff that to me it's interesting to the lengths that people are going to like try to create this ripple effect of action in the space. And I just really appreciate that about you. So I know,
well,
and I
thank
know
you
we've
so
talked a
much.
lot about like, is it, being imperfect or an imperfect advocate, or, and even, I mean, like, yeah, we could talk for hours about how much doubt and imposter syndrome I had about taking on some of those conversations around representation in the outdoors. Absolutely. Even this conversation around like what is climate, what are we build, like how do we build an inclusive climate movement in the outdoors. But I think that like I've loved talking to you in various forms about like the doubts and the sort of self, maybe it's imposter syndrome, maybe it's self-doubt that like I also hold in this space. But I do think that's what I want to try to do with these conversations here, is just highlight what's happening, highlight the movement building. And that does mean like
Yeah,
passing the mic and elevating stories and solutions. But it's also super interesting that you said what you said about like a lot of climate solutions are sort of engineered by a very homogenous group of people and imposed upon communities as sort of like, this is a climate solution, you need to
yeah.
you need to
Here's
uphold
a
it, or
tax
you
break
here
to
take
use
it.
our climate
Exactly,
solution the way
exactly,
we built for you.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, gosh, it's hard. Yeah.
No, I like that, and your point about intention versus impact, I think is really important. That's something I think about a lot, because we had
Yeah. Of
the purest intentions last year, and we also
course.
had a negative impact on several people, and these things coexist: the best possible intentions and also a negative impact from that. Um, and so in some sense, like if we ask people who are impacted by these things, if we ask anything of them, it's grace, really, because the intentions are valuable, not as an excuse. Oh, I meant to do well. Sorry. It's not an excuse. It's not acceptable. But the intention is when that matters is like after you've made a mistake. Your intention will carry you through the acknowledgement and understanding and solution to that mistake, I
Hmm.
think. That's kind
Hmm.
of what I think of
I
it
like
for
that.
myself. So I'm very imperfect, and I have the best intentions, and I make mistakes. And if the people who are impacted by my mistakes will give me grace, I will listen and I'll learn, and I'll use the intentions that weren't enough to prevent the mistake. I will use them to do better next time.
To carry you through. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I like thinking
So
about it that way.
I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if that's valid, but I don't know. I think about it.
Yeah, totally. Um, I know I don't want to like I have like I feel like we could
We're
talk
good.
about this stuff for hours, so this is
Yeah.
great. But I think I guess this take as much time as you need to think about this too. But like if I am trying to get more towards a solutions oriented lens on this podcast, even though we just talked about how like so often solutions are engineered and just handed over. But given that you are someone who has literally changed a lot of parts of their life at some points in your life to be more climate friendly or take actions that you felt aligned with, you know, being climate neutral. It's interesting here about the cargo ship becoming, you're like, it's not really neutral. Like it was actually like quite polluting, like, and you kind
Yeah.
of deep dove on that. But aside from maybe applying to a footprints camp, what what would you sort of tell someone if there's someone listening who's like, man, I just want to like take action. I don't know what to do. I can't necessarily become I can't change my diet. I don't drive an electric vehicle. Like I'm just curious, like you are someone I look to as an experimenter in your life of like actions you've taken. And then you're kind of like, oh, that didn't really work. But I'm just curious, like what you would sort of say, or like just general thoughts on like taking an action towards being like better in this world. You said something about if you're human, you're contributing to climate change, which is sort of like a depressing but true thing, right? It's real. It's not wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm kind
Well,
of I'm curious
yeah.
if you have like what you would say on this.
Yeah, it's a hard thing. I don't have the greatest answer. But when I made that comment about being a human and basically having to contribute to climate change, what I'm really getting at is that there are systems in place for our
Yeah.
energy infrastructure, especially, but transportation, commerce, everything, agriculture, that are like gigantic and global and far beyond the control of any single person who's not a senator or the president or in charge of these companies. And those are the systems that are causing this problem. No individual, no normal person who works a normal day job and just wants to live a good life. It's not your fault. You haven't caused this, and like you could go take your reusable shopping bag to the grocery store every day for 50 years, and it's not going to make a noticeable difference because that's not the problem. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the problem is this capitalistic system, and especially like what I've really been learning and studying a lot lately is like just global finance. That's the problem. Global
Hmm.
finance and the way that money flows basically away from people who are impacted by inequality and climate change and into disproportionately into the hands of people who have gigantic control over corporations and energy infrastructure, transportation, political decisions, agriculture. All these big systems are being controlled by money, and the money, the people in charge of the world are also in charge of the most money almost always. And so, the fact that, for example, poor countries are poor countries, especially in like, for example, Southern Africa or South America, it's not because they don't have resources or labor or knowledge about how to be better. It's because the economic core of the world, basically the United States and Western Europe, has like
Hmm.
forced them into these toxic and predatory loans, which they can literally never pay back.
Hmm.
Um, and and it's this gigantic system. And so this is really depressing. I'm super sorry. But global
No,
finance
this is
is, I
interesting.
think,
Yeah.
one of the most pervasive problems. I think that is kind of the real root cause here. And this financial system like really benefits from excluding people and especially
Yeah.
certain groups of people. And so the people in Southern Africa look a lot different than most of the people in charge of financial centers in the United States. And
No.
it's not really a coincidence.
Yeah.
But yeah, I should probably be less aggressive about things. I'm not a
It's
financial
okay.
expert here, but what
Yeah.
one person that really has helped me understand this is Jason Hickel, who's an economist. I think he grew up in Southern Africa somewhere. I think he works at the London School of Economics now. He's an amazing writer, really, really good
Hmm.
leader on this stuff. Possibly a great person to get on the podcast if ever possible.
Yeah.
Jason Hickel. He wrote a book called The Divide, and another where he really talks about, or another called Less is More, which talks about the degrowth movement, which is about how
Mm-hmm.
our economic system requires infinite growth. But that is an insane proposition, but it's the one we live by every day. And so degrowth is a economic model that allows for like a stable amount, basically a stable economic system that doesn't require us to make more and buy more and have more every year. So it's been really interesting learning about that. And I'm sorry that went really dark there, but
No.
it does help me. Honestly, like the first step to this stuff that helps me when I get so overwhelmed by these issues is understanding how they're happening. It doesn't mean that I can do anything about global finance or these other big issues, but it does help me to at least not feel completely like at the center of this swirling maelstrom that I could never have ever even pick apart into its component pieces. Um, it helps me to start to make sense of it. And then it's like, what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing that really, one article I really like came from a magazine that or a website I'm forgetting, but it talks about something called a climate shadow rather than a climate footprint. And it mentions how the idea of a climate footprint was actually invented by marketing people who worked for BP. BP hired
Right.
this
Yes.
marketing team to come up with a way to basically absolve them of their culpability in the climate crisis. And so they came up with this campaign that was like, everybody can make a difference. It's like,
Yeah.
while BP continues to like pump billions of dollars a year into global and especially American elections, as well as like pumping oil and everything, you should use a reusable mug at Starbucks. Um, all these little things. And so the climate
Yeah.
shadow concept, it's a fascinating article that starts with this sort of question, or two questions. It's like, what about, if there's two people, one person flies domestically once a week for their job, the other person walks to their office every day of the week to their job. Who has a bigger climate footprint? You're like, well, obviously the
Mm-hmm.
person who flies has a bigger footprint.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, what if the person who walks to work every day is like an oil executive, going
Oh,
to work at
exactly. Yeah.
his office there. And what if the person who flies every week is a climate scientist going to conferences to talk about the dangers of climate change and what you can do about it? Well, it's like, yeah, he has a bigger a personal footprint in that moment, but
Mm-hmm.
he's actually having a much, much more positive impact as a whole. And so the idea of the climate shadow was, basically like the oil executive has a smaller footprint, a greater shadow. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we think about these things, what exactly can we really do to reduce our shadow? And I'm sorry, I've just been
Hmm.
rambling at this point. It's just
Oh
going
my
on
God, dude,
forever.
this is
But I
amazing. I
think
love
that
this.
I really think that like the best thing you can do is like reduce everything you can. Don't drive as much, get an electric car, eat a vegan diet. I don't know. I don't have an electric car and I eat meat off and on. I'm not perfect. But what I do want to do is talk about climate change. We make
Yeah.
this a part of the conversation and we start to like bring people in on it and we get other people involved. We don't polarize it. It's okay. We're all a part of the problem. We're all like not we don't want to be part of the problem. We can do what we can. Anything is better than nothing. Get people in your family and your friends, your community involved. Just talking about it. That's what Catherine Hayhoe is always about. Her whole book, Saving Us, amazing book. She's always just like, just
Yeah.
talk about it. Don't let this become a stigmatized or taboo issue because then, you'll never talk about it, and then it's just not something we ever will act on because we don't know anything about it and we're too afraid to discuss this issue that's affecting every single one of our lives every day in ways we know or don't know about it. Um, and I had something else I was going with this, but
No, this is so great. I want to quote
oh
you on
man, I
this
had
because
the
this
whole
is literally
thing.
like
Sorry.
the thesis of my podcast. No, no. Well, if you remember it, please, please. But this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm doing this, right? It's like we have to
Yeah.
talk about it. We got to talk about it more, and also to know that like it's okay. It's okay. Like Dakota Jones drives this car and does like what, you know what I mean? It's like that. It's gonna
Yeah.
be okay. Like someone who cares so deeply about this is my point. Is not this is not like an
Yeah.
exploitative like headline podcast, but like
Yeah, but you
it's
could.
really yeah, this just in yeah, it feels like having like, I mean, there's something, the shadow thing is so cool, and I want to try to link to that article actually and try to find it, but
Yeah, I'll send it
there's
to you. I
something
have it.
about, it's known that like talking about and climate communications and like talking about it is sort of this like has been like shown to shift folks even just in their like personal beliefs on things, not even
For
in
sure.
action. But I think that also, and it was actually Claire Gallagher, shout out to Claire multiple times in this podcast episode, like where she, I think, posted something at one point about like, you doing your personal actions are great, but like the real this was many years ago, and this was the first time I heard someone say like it's actually like what politicians we elect. and it's actually like the policies that are in
Yeah,
place, and it's actually sort of this bigger. And
exactly.
I'm like, oh, got it.
And
And
when
that
you
was a real
talk about it
aha
with
moment for
people,
me.
maybe they'll be more like, yeah, talking about it will maybe make people more likely to elect someone who's more climate friendly.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I like
Yeah.
that.
So that's the
You know,
hope.
one thing that comes,
That's the hope.
the other thing I was going to say that comes to mind is Nicholas
Yeah.
Kristof is a really great writer.
Mm-hmm.
Writes for the New York Times. He's written several books. I read a really good article by him about gun control, and he was talking about how, you know, one solution to gun control is not to just ban all guns, it's to like treat them the way that we treat things like cigarettes or like car
Mm-hmm.
safety, where it's like if you don't wear your seatbelt, like that's not really okay with most people. And if you buy a,
Right.
or you know, you have to wear a seatbelt. It's like this societal expectation that you wear a seatbelt. And there's also like this societal expectation now that like we all know cigarettes are really bad for you. And when you buy a cigarette, it's like cigarettes, you're welcome to buy them as much as you want, but they're taxed heavily. And when you buy them, there's like a picture of a lung with lung cancer on there. It's like this will kill you
Mm-hmm.
and make your children sick and like all kinds of terrible stuff, which is true, right? And so the point is like with those things, they have not become outlawed or banned, but they are like stigmatized, rightly so, within our society because they cause harm to individuals and communities within our society. Um, Not wearing a seatbelt or, you know, smoking. And
Mm-hmm.
so climate change, I feel like, could potentially have solutions as well. You know, you go to the gas station and it's like
Yeah.
there's a picture of, you know, whatever, something, or like some not information about like what gas does to
Hmm.
you. And but if you're going to do that, it's like somebody who's just trying to like make ends meet and has to get to work to pay for food
Right.
for their family, you know, like they got to have other options, right? So it's not quite as simple as that. Um,
Yeah.
but if we like create a system where, you know, we're not going to eliminate the oil industry, but if we like create better options and then we're like, hey, the oil industry is actually super bad and here's all these reasons why, that I think is that speaks to me as like effective climate action in the long term on a large scale. But your question was about individuals. So sorry.
Don't be sorry. No, it's so complex. I knew I could dive into this stuff with you because I like this is
Yeah.
like the Ryan and I joke. This is like a like sort of what's behind the curtain of my mind. He's like, I feel like you're always just
Yeah.
thinking about like climate and justice, and I'm like, yeah, I am. Like that's what's in my
That's
brain.
true.
It's what's in your brain too. It's cool. It's cool. Yeah, it's awesome. We're coming up on an hour, so I feel like I'm so grateful for the time and you've spent, and also want to make sure you get to bed over there. The okay, so and this I'm probably gonna cut this part out as I give the preamble, but I wanted to do the like
Nice.
intro is sort of the like what's your aha moment, and then the last question I want to ask everybody is sort of around like uh yeah, well, I'll just tell you. I'll just say it to you. All right, I just gotta go back into the mode. Um, what is your favorite climate solution right now that's not yours, and why? So, not
Hmm.
footprints, because that's a climate solution I feel like you've brought into this world. I mean, it can be footprint. You can be like, footprints is totally my favorite, but like, I would love to hear like
Yeah,
what you're
totally.
looking at in the world, and you're like, oh, that's an interesting one. And maybe it's talking
Yeah.
about climate. Maybe that's the climate solution. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, my advice is that you should give that question to people at the start of the podcast and say like, think
At the
about it. At
start.
the end, I'm gonna ask you. You got to
Cool.
come up with that. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah. Because
just
now
made
I'm
me
like
think about
putting
it.
you on the spot. Yeah.
No,
Right.
but
Right.
it's
All right.
good. No, I mean, really,
Cool.
my solution for the individual, like, I just want to reiterate, the solution is to educate yourself on the issue and talk about the issue. That's what you can do that's
Yeah.
better than anything. And you're going to learn about a lot of other things you can do in your personal life, your community life. It's awesome. But the biggest things, in my opinion, are to learn about it, talk about it. But like
Yeah.
I mentioned, you know, like finance is a huge part of it. So also like, you know, divest from oil and gas stocks if you have stocks, um, and work with banks that are sustainable. I work with Atmos Bank, which is very sustainable. It's quite cool. Um, but yeah, like as a large scale, like what's my favorite climate solution? It's not mine. I think it's the degrowth movement. like I mentioned earlier, and I am far from an expert on this, but this is a way to move our economy away from one that is literally required, whether or not it's needed, it's required to take more resources out of the ground, to move capital
Yeah.
around, to like take things from the earth, from people, and repackage them for profit. It's like it's even good people have to do this in order to like live their lives because of the way our economy is structured. It's insane. The degrowth movement offers a way to like have a functioning economy that allows for competition and profit without requiring that we make more, do more, use more, sell more every year. Um, and I think that that's like a pretty fundamental solution. It's not even technically a climate solution, but that's one. But that's a solution that will make our world much more fair and much more sustainable. So that's at
No, I
least
think
where
it
my
is a
mind
climate
is and
solution
what I'm
then.
trying to learn about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to link out to that actually, so I may follow up with you and to get some of these
Yeah.
books and
I have the
articles
books
and
like right
everything.
over here. Yeah.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, let me bring it onto screen right now.
I mean, I have all
Dude,
kinds.
I really feel like I could talk to you for so many more hours about this, but I'll stop us here. But seriously, thank you so much for this conversation. I learned a ton. I also am really excited to share this with people because I feel like they need to hear what you have to say. And we are all imperfect climate advocates doing our best. And I just really appreciate you talking about it and kind of opening up on these
Well, yeah.
topics. So thank you.
I mean, you creating this space is huge. Like you said, when I say like we got to talk about it, I mean, there's nobody doing that better than you. It's a huge gift to have
Oh,
you. So thank you so much.
thank you,
I can't
Dakota. I
wait to
really
share the other
appreciate that.
episodes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Um, okay. I'm going to stop recording